Dr. Ottolenhi, you're with us virtually. We'd welcome your response to that question in the broader context of trade-based money laundering. If you could be with us at this time. Perhaps we have there he is. Dr. Ottolenhi, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes, Panama. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I apologize for not being able to be there in person. Don't be misguided by thinking that I avoided you because I'm skiing, as you can see in the background. I'm actually in my home in the Washington area. It's a great honor to participate in this panel. It's a pleasure. I think that this initiative is extremely important. It's been going on for a number of years, thanks to the leadership of Congressman Robert Pittenger. I want to thank him in particular for continuing tenaciously to pursue this issue. And this issue that we're discussing today on this panel is of particular urgency and importance. Let me start with a figure. The United Nations assesses that the global value of the annual trade of drugs globally is in excess of $320 billion US dollars. Now, that is a staggering figure for just one of many illicit activities that organized crime is involved in. Organized crime has morphed in the last 3 decades. It has become globalized as much as the licit legal economy. And a globalized illicit industry that generates this amount of revenues needs avenues to repatriate the ill-gotten gains of crime through formal financial channels. When you're handling more than $300 billion a year's worth of revenue, you simply don't have enough suitcases and twin-engine planes to move it about across the world. That is where trade-based money laundering comes in. Trade-based money laundering is very, very simply put, a system, a mechanism to move value from point A to point B. Drug cartels deliver cocaine to buyers, let's say in the United States. Drugs are sold on the streets. Money is handed over to drug dealers. It goes up the chain of supply. At some point, those large quantities of cash collected on the street and through informal mechanisms across the United States or across Europe or elsewhere, wherever the market may be, need to be sent back to the seller. And that kind of money cannot travel in cash across borders. That's where the trade-based money laundering comes in. Companies sometimes set up with the specific purpose of laundering the money, or sometimes legitimate businesses who offer their services occasionally to crime, lend their hands to move the cash. How do they do that? In a variety of ways. They make up fake, false, fraudulent invoices in order to justify the transit of money through their bank accounts. They send merchandise that is counterfeit, but declare the value as if it was a real brand. So they engage in intellectual property fraud as well. They overcharge the cost of the merchandise they're selling. One example that I can mention to you from a a case involving a Turkish gold trader that was laundering money for the Islamic Republic of Iran in one specific transaction. He had his yacht manufacturing company charge $250 a pound of brown sugar to a non-existent company. That is the kind of fraudulent paperwork that is involved in the cover-up of movement of money through regular channels. And here, and therefore you have hundreds of companies that can play this game, thousands indeed, because we live in a globalized economy where the volume of trade is staggering, and the ability of authorities in entry points of each country, whether it's customs or airport and port authorities, to monitor physically the merchandise is extremely limited. Of course, there are ways to, sophisticated ways to try and pinpoint anomalous shipments based on a variety of factors, such as the weights declared, such as the prices declared, such as the nature of the merchandise traded. When you have a company that deals in electronics, for example, that sells PlayStation platforms all the time, and all of a sudden they're shipping cosmetics, that's an anomaly. When you have a company that deals with clothing and they suddenly buy 40 tons of charcoal from Latin America, that's an anomaly. So those are things that authorities can do. But they cannot monitor all the traffic, because doing that would eventually, essentially, disrupt the global economy. So cartels and the hundreds, thousands of companies involved in trade-based money laundering count on that fact. The fact that the ability of authorities to monitor each and every transaction, to inspect and verify the nature of the merchandise declared at shipment and origin or destination is limited. And here is the second problem, enters the terrorists, because while cartels and organized crime or crime syndicates may have control of their territories wherever they may be, Mexican cartels in Mexico, Colombian cartels in Colombia, PCC in Brazil, the Andrangheta in Calabria, in southern Italy, and so on. But when they globalize their business, and the revenue they generate through their illicit activities has to be returned to them from distant shores, they don't necessarily have a presence where they're doing business. If a Colombian cartel sells cocaine to Australia, to a criminal underworld buyer in Australia, they don't necessarily have the infrastructure to bring the money back from Australia. And building it is expensive, it's complicated, because you have to go to a terrain that you're not familiar with. That terrain is controlled by other criminal organizations. And here's where the terrorist groups come in, especially the Lebanese Hezbollah. Why? Because the Lebanese Hezbollah relies on a global network of expatriates, and the Lebanese diaspora is one of the most globalized and spread out in the world. A global network of expatriates to launder money. And the advantage that they provide to their criminal partners is that they have businesses everywhere they can rely on. They trade in just about anything. They can rely on the loyalty of their members. And they're not competing. So when the Colombian cartel sells to Australia, they may do a deal with a local criminal buyer, but for the money to return, they rely on Hezbollah. Hezbollah does not compete with them in that market. It doesn't try to steal a chunk of the market. It acts as a mediator, as an intermediary, as a service provider. And that is why you see, when you look at TBML, trade-based money laundering, you see a lot of interaction between crime and terror finance. Of course, those involved in providing this type of service are not doing it um, out of any other reason but to make money for themselves. To provide services to criminal organized crime means that you're engaging in a high risk business. And so typically you can charge significant amounts of money. Cartels don't file a tax return on April 15th every year, so they don't have to factor in the cost of taxes and accountants to comply with legislation. Spending 10-15% of their income to launder the money back and have it available at their own disposal is actually a quite inexpensive proposition. And so this is what happens. They rely on a terror organization to launder money. And this is happening on a global scale. Once again, the networks are complex, cross-border, trans-jurisdictional, relying on a mixture of ideological commitment, family connections, greed, and opportunism. And so, for example, one important trade-based money laundering scheme that US authorities investigated in the past decade that should probably resonate, especially to a Central American audience, involved a Colombian-based Lebanese national named Ayman Juma, who was working closely with Mexican and Colombian cartels. The network, at the height of its activity, was laundering as much as 200 million US dollars a month. And when you consider that they were taking anything between 8 and 15% of $200 million a month, you realize that this network alone was generating more than $200 million of revenue for Hezbollah every year. The network was relying on a mixture of informal and formal channels. The informal channels involved Hawala and the black market, the black peso market exchange system to move money informally between money exchangers through networks of confidence and mutual trust. But it was also relying on on a large-scale scheme that involved companies in the United States, in West Africa, in Lebanon, and in Asia. The companies in the United States were selling used cars in West Africa, who were using the cash from cocaine proceeds. The cars were being resold locally at a profit, and the revenues from that operation would then be channeled to Lebanon, to accounts that would be used by companies in Asia to buy merchandise and then sell it back to front companies in Venezuela and Colombia. So that was the way that the money was moving from the cocaine being shipped to being sold, to the money being funneled through multiple stages and returned back to the Colombian and Mexican cartels. At each stage, there would be transactions between buyers and sellers, and the money would move in one direction and merchandise in the other. All of that was not real commerce, but it was designed to move the money back to the cartels. And so this is why it is so important to focus on trade-based money laundering. There are many ways to launder money, and there are many new avenues and opportunities, from cryptocurrencies to the traditional schemes of moving money in suitcases or relying on or precious metals and so on. But in the global economy where we live in, with the volume of trade annually growing and merchandise moving across the globe at staggering quantities and speed, trade-based money laundering remains one of the most important ways criminal syndicates launder money, and it is increasingly one of the ways that terror organizations such as the Lebanese Hezbollah raise funds independently to support their own ideological struggles. So it is extremely important that this forum looks at this topic and draws some important practical lessons that can be applied through legislation and through enforcement. One important thing that I would like all of you in the audience to take away is this. As I said, oftentimes in trade-based money laundering schemes, we see the convergence of terror finance and organized crime. This convergence is toxic for a number of reasons. Now, for many countries in Latin America especially, the issue of terrorism is remote, especially when you mention Hezbollah. Hezbollah is in Lebanon. The conflict that Hezbollah participate in are a world away. But what Hezbollah does to fund those conflicts is not a world away. It is at your doorstep. Because as I said, when you look at these transactions, there are a number of violations. There is contraband, there is tax evasion, there is intellectual property fraud, there is corruption of public officials, there is sometimes there are environmental impacts. One of the things we've seen in recent times from Latin America involving drug cartels and potentially Hezbollah is the extensive use of charcoal as an export cover for drugs. Charcoal, carbón vegetal, is one of the drivers of deforestation in Latin America. We are seeing a significant uptick in illegal gold mining, which is destroying the environment in Latin America, whether it's Brazil or Venezuela, Colombia or Peru. A lot of these activities are linked to organized crime, and they also feed additional criminal endeavors such as human trafficking, because the illegal mining villages need prostitution for the workers, among other things. So it is a chain, a cascade of crimes that are related to these types of activities. And that is why it's important for governments to pay attention to them, because while terrorism may not directly impact governments in the region, but the consequences of terror finance being complicit with organized crime are significant and impact you locally and directly. Second of all, very important to mention, some of these organizations, such as the Lebanese Hezbollah, in order to maintain loyalty and influence within the communities that help them, invest considerable resources in indoctrinating and radicalizing the youth. So they're actually exporting a problem of radicalization and intolerance in those societies where they operate. And third of all, of course, by facilitating crime, taking resources away from the state, whether it is, again, tax evasion or contraband or intellectual fraud or a variety of other such crimes, they are reducing the amount of resources that governments have to invest in the things that government should invest in: infrastructure, good governance, education, public health, and so on. So the damage that these schemes cause to government are staggering, and they require being addressed. And one of the ways they can be better addressed is to increase transparency at all levels. First, transparency in public commercial records. It is extremely of value and of importance that governments enforce the principle of corporate transparency. People need to know who their clients are. We need to know who's behind the business. Here in the United States, in my own county, I can access the real estate records of my county and find out where you own a house and whether you have a mortgage and at what bank you have a mortgage. But if you own a company, I do not know who's the real owner. That's a problem. And again, the United States is not at the forefront of fixing it, but it is extremely important that transparency be increased. That is the first step. The second step, of course, is that given that you're dealing oftentimes with crime and terror finance combined, you need intelligence agencies and law enforcement to work together. Third, what you need to also encourage and enhance is cooperation among governments and their public agencies and public officials. For example, when you have a trade-based money laundering scheme, almost invariably you will have companies that are involved which are based in 2, 3, or 4 different countries. You cannot tackle effectively and prosecute and bring people to justice effectively these challenges unless the justice system, the police, the law enforcement agencies of these countries have a tradition and a procedure and a mutual confidence to share the information. The other thing is, of course, that sharing information needs to happen between law enforcement, which is focused on bringing people to justice, and intelligence, which is more focused on the preventative side. Now, sometimes the information that the intelligence has cannot be leveraged in court, but it can help the law enforcement better understand what they're confronting. More communication between the two is therefore of the essence. And this type of transparency and communication across borders should also happen in those specific spheres that are most involved on a day-to-day basis in trade, namely customs authorities and port authorities, and also the financial institutions that are processing the payments for trade. Oftentimes, that information is there, but is not being shared between the stakeholders in a timely way to ensure that bad transactions are caught. So, at all levels, transparency. Last but not least, and it seems important in this forum, oftentimes, especially in the world of a global economy of the 21st century with the digitalized world, the corporate world, companies, private corporate companies have their own intelligence gathering and due diligence mechanisms, which sometimes have better information and are faster in gathering and processing than government agencies. So there also needs to be a lot more communication between law enforcement, government stakeholders on the one hand, and the private sector. And again, there is a lot to gain. Who is going to be hurt when intellectual property fraud happens? The state, for sure, because there's revenue lost from taxes, but it is also the global brand that is harmed. So, once again, transparency at all levels, cooperation between law enforcement and intelligence, cooperation across borders, cooperation between trade, customs agencies, and dialogue between government and the private sector can go a long way to mitigate this challenge. I'm going to stop here, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Ottolenhi. Do we have further